Good morning. Welcome. Hope you're having a nice day. The sun just came out here. So, usually the sun going in and out means that the light on the video gets wonky. So, hopefully it'll stay steady. Last week, I talked about truth and how our perception of truth is shaped by our experience and our conditioning. If we're conditioned to believe certain things, then what happens is we filter our experience through that lens and see that things that support what we already believe are brought in and accepted and included and validate what we already know. But what happens is you could take the same person and put him in, or two people in the same situation, and they can interpret and see the situation completely differently. So an example of this is if someone was looking at a fairy tale from what's often a feminist lens, and they see it from the conditioned mind, which is literal, logical, and rational, then they say that the fairy tale is the heroine is a victim. But when I look at it, because I look at it symbolically, what I see is that the heroine is actually a hero of the story. She has strength and she faces challenges and she has to grow through the whole fairy tale. So this just shows you how the condition, because I've reconditioned my mind to perceive things from a symbolic standpoint, and if someone else is still in their patriarchal kind of left brain perspective, then they can see it completely differently, and you can see how that would really shape your experience of the story. For one person, it becomes something that needs to be discarded, and for someone else, like myself, I think it contains valuable information. So completely different perspectives on the exact same situation, just based on our conditioning. So that's kind of where we're going to go today, a little bit deeper from last week, where we just talked about the different perspectives and how they filter our experience and create what we believe is truth, that we are seeing the true version of reality and other people don't. So I could say, I'm seeing the true version of reality because I'm seeing the symbolic nature of the fairy tale. But the other person would say, absolutely not. You're totally living in a dreamland, because they can't see through that lens. And so for them, the truth is obvious. And for me, the truth is obvious. So I think it's a good example of how these two things change. And this is going to be applicable to you as we go along, and hopefully you'll see that. So we've been conditioned to believe in this culture, in the Western cultures, that the value and is outside of us, and that what we need to be fulfilled and to experience and go through life is external. It's left-brained. It's all the things I've talked about a lot in terms of the patriarchy and what it has valued and had as a preference. And so the thing is that the quality of life isn't based on the externals. The quality of life is based on the internal experience. Also, it could be perceived as nature. Things that are aligned more with, again, what's perceived as feminine, things that are tend to historically be put in the feminine category as opposed to the masculine. So getting more stuff, achieving more goals, all of those things that most of us have been conditioned to believe, more education, more degrees, all those things we were taught would make us feel fulfilled. And then many people eventually came to understand and realize that it didn't. And I think a great example of this is COVID. When people stopped going to work and were at home and just kind of stopped, like the busyness went away, there was nowhere to run, then people began to really sit with themselves and be like, I don't want to go back. And those are when we can make choices, when we don't have the options to kind of run away, but have to kind of sit with ourselves and say, what do I really feel? That job isn't fulfilling. And so we saw a huge shift. I mean, they called it the mass resignation around COVID. And I think that's one of the positive things about that particular time, and how it was to benefit us, was to for us to begin to really get in touch with the inner, to get in touch with our feelings, to get in touch with our soul. And I think that was one of the elements of the soul coming more online, and the feminine coming more to consciousness in the culture, and the value of it being received more and more. So throughout history, there is this esoteric thread that shows the value and importance of the inner life. And through different periods, which I'll go through a little bit later, I mentioned before Betty Kovac's work, where it came online and then it was pushed underground again. And this has happened repeatedly throughout at least the past 2,000 years, where it becomes obvious and then it goes underground, and it becomes obvious and it goes back underground. And right now we're in this moment where it's coming back into awareness. So this is also an important part of what I'm talking about today, because it's emphasizing the importance of this particular time as the consciousness of humanity is evolving, and what's required of us, and how we're participating, and how we can participate more actively. And the really critical importance of this right now can't be overstated. So what we're talking about here is opening to value all experience that's been rejected, repressed, and ignored by the culture. And I'm going to talk about this. I know I have talked about it before, and with regard to the fairy tales, I'm not going to talk about them so much today, but I'm going to talk about the implications of it at a deeper level than I think I've done before, and more personal, not in terms of my personal, but in terms of our personal way of seeing this. So the things that have been ignored by the culture, that we need to include these in our reality or our worldview and embody them, right? Which is where the title came from today. Most are related and pertain to the feminine and the right brain way of perceiving the world. So what things have if you haven't heard me say these enough times before, I'll very quickly just run through them. So emotion, intuition, these things are required to heal ourselves and to grow in consciousness. So the fact that they have been devalued for all these years means that this healing that hasn't been consciously available to us, especially the times when the esoteric knowledge went under, that is all about coming to terms with emotion and valuing intuition. It like, these are critical steps, critical components to coming to greater consciousness. Imagination and symbolic language. The imagination has value and is valid, and is a valid way to know and receive information that, again, even myself, I don't know, let's see how many years ago, quite a few now, maybe 10 or more, when I had a visionary experience, I dismissed it. And it wasn't until all this confirmation came in from the world around me that I was like, oh, I'm supposed to pay attention to this. So I think like our kind of knee-jerk reaction to things like that is like, it's not real. I just made it up. So those things aren't always just not real and just made up. And so it's giving that kind of thing understanding. And then the example I used at the beginning in terms of symbolic language, the value of that as well. And I can't tell you how many times I have seen quotes from people who talk about the value of symbolism. The alchemists in particular, who were working on consciousness and evolving their own consciousness, according to Jung, they said straight out, what we put in words, we said nothing. So this really, you could see in terms of a fairy tale, right? The words say nothing, but the symbolism in the images, they said, is where we said everything. And look at Jesus in Christianity speaking in parables. These things were not literal. They were not logical, because then it wasn't overt, because the overt wasn't allowed. That would have gotten you killed back in the day. So the heart and soul has value and validity. And as I said again at the beginning, where the idea we've been conditioned to believe that fulfillment comes from more, from the outer, from consuming. And in fact, it comes from living in the heart and soul and honoring those things. It's about the senses and the body and the non-physical, so otherworldly, like the inner world, right? These things are not physical, tangible kind of things that we can kind of grasp onto, which, you know, in our materialistic society, it's even, you know, there's this shift right now happening with science and physics in particular, where they're kind of having to acknowledge, and some are starting to, that there's an underlying reality that they can't measure with their instruments that actually has validity. And so that's not an accepted perspective yet. Had this conversation with my sister, I think it was last week. She was like, what? And then I said, well, the inner world has, you know, consciousness has primacy. And she was like, yeah, I know some people believe that. She was like, but that's not accepted. She's very smart. There, and other forms of knowing are not particularly valued, right? Connection, community, and equality are three more things, again, associated with the feminine, right? The interconnection, the community, like these things have value in terms of the feminine perception. So at the same time as accepting these things, we're questioning what we've accepted as normal. And I've heard this over and over again, especially from my guides. They're like, you don't question what you take as evident in truth. And so when we begin to really open up to the possibility that some of the things that we're just assuming are true, like I said, someone looking at a fairy tale from a literal perspective, like assuming that that is true. And so to begin to open up to allow the possibility that things that we already believe are true may not in fact be. So this idea of inferior and superior, that's like baked in to our way of seeing the world. The fight for freedom, this idea that we have to fight to win. We have to, in order for those things to be true, there's something we have to fight against. And that type of thinking requires another, and as an opposition. So it's really understanding, again, is that true? Is it true that we need inferior, superior? Is it true that we need an enemy and we have to fight? And if we're all interconnected, which, you know, even physics says this now, that it's just one quantum soup. And so if that is the case, then what in the end are we fighting against? We have to question these things and ask ourselves. And not only that, but does this have value? And what kind of a world do I live in? And what kind of worldview do I have if I believe that there are enemies out in the world? And is it possible that that's not true and that I could live in a different way? So the idea of a zero-sum game, right? Very similar with regard to that. Both of those things really is this idea that, yeah, only one person's needs can be met. Only one person can win. And then we have these artificial boundaries. You've probably heard people talk about this before with regard to even a country. If you look at a country, the idea of the boundaries, it's not a real thing. It's a thing like on a piece of paper. It's not like you can actually go out and walk out and see the lines where the states change on the road. So again, what does that mean then if there are no, if the boundaries are artificial? They're based in the physical world. And so again, if we're shifting to the feminine in the inner, then if I'm looking at my sense of my family, isn't that an artificial boundary that's based in the physical world? Is that true? And if I am the soul, and the soul is immortal and comes into this body and then leaves this body, And if my family is based on this body, then is that an artificial boundary as well? Then we have things like race and gender, which also, again, gender is based in the body. These things are based on the physical form. And if we are the soul's on a soul level, we are all equal. We are all the same. So again, it's not just understanding these things, but it's actually saying, how does this change my life? How does this change my experience of life and how I relate to the world and to others? Our reality is created from the inside out. That was my discussion with my sister. that the consciousness comes before the physical reality. The consciousness shapes our experience. So the conditioning, even we could say, of someone looking at a fairy tale literally versus me looking at it symbolically, is how the inside is changing my experience of the outside. But this goes way beyond that, right? If you're conditioned to have, like, you have a certain kind of parent, and then the person that you marry can be like exactly like them, or can be the exact opposite of them. And so if it's a reaction or the same, right? And so that's like explaining how that inner experience is shaping the outer, and how the inner and consciousness is determining who we're attracted to, what we're attracted to, what we do. That just shows how everything inside is what's determining what's happening outside. So the inner change is what leads to lasting outer change. And I've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now because I've been emphasizing that we're part of the collective, and that the collective challenges that we're experiencing right now, the cultural challenges we're experiencing right now, have to be resolved within ourselves too. That's the way the collective is going to change. Once we accept the awareness and insights that come from these different modes of knowing and experiencing, our worldview and our life will be transformed. And to a certain degree, a lot of this stuff, again, can be intellectual, and it's about shifting from the intellect to an embodied knowing and understanding of the implications of these new ways of seeing. So the patterns are personal and collective. So, which I've also talked with regard to the fairy tales. And so this is a historical moment that we're in. In the past, women and things associated with the feminine were pushed back, which means they went into the unconscious. So things that are not seen, acknowledged, and validated go into the unconscious. So emotion, intuition, because they're not like valued and validated, the imagination, then they are automatically, typically dismissed and ignored. We just dismiss it in ourselves because it's not being reinforced by the outer world. So the esoteric knowledge of life and transforming consciousness was repressed historically and went back into the unconscious, went underground. And so it was hidden, like I said, with the alchemists while they were doing their work, the fairy tales, the myths. And I've been talking a bit about this over the past couple of weeks. So what's the link between the feminine and the esoteric, which has historically been repressed? These two things kind of went together. And that is that these things that are associated with the feminine lead to higher consciousness. So they had to be repressed. And the higher consciousness and these things associated with higher consciousness had to do with the inner world and the esoteric. So again, the intuition, imagination, emotion, all of these things are required for evolving consciousness. And this is how we create a new reality, which I've talked to you about before, the importance of the intuition with regard to that. Betty Kovacs, who I mentioned before, had talked about 5 phases of Renaissance, 4 historically, the 5th we're in right now. So the High Middle Ages was 1, Italian Renaissance, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. I'm not going to give you all these dates because it's probably too much. If you're interested in any of this, you can look it up. I was like, should I bother just saying all those dates? I would have, if I was listening, I'd be like, whoop, okay, I'll remember the names. And then the English and German Romantic movements, which are interesting because those dates are 1775 look at how interesting that is, 1775 to 1850. So at the 1865 was when the American Civil War ended, and 1776 is when we founded the United States. So the Declaration of Independence. So in 1875 is when the Statue of Liberty, who you might have heard me talk about or write about before, because I think it's a very significant symbol in our culture, and it was entitled "Liberty Enlightening the World," right, based on the goddess Libertas. So the U.S. ideals of freedom and democracy were appreciated by the French, and that's how that whole thing kind of came to be. I guess this is kind of an aside here. It's not really that relevant. It's not that important. So these cycles, again, of emergence, awakening, enlightening, these cycles of this happening have reflected in the Persephone video I did, where we talked about this kind of descent and then the search and the ascent. So right now we're in the process of this like ascent out of the underworld, and that is a tricky time, right? That was the moment when Psyche came out of the underworld, looked in the box, and her consciousness was transformed. And as I've been talking about this collective resistance to the emergence of the feminine, again, we're seeing it in the culture, we're seeing it in the politics. And what's so interesting about this is, where I got my doctorate was Pacifica Graduate Institute in California, and their motto is Anima Mundi Calende Gratia, which is Latin for the sake of tending the soul of the world. It's an anomaly, I think. I think there are too many schools like this. It's like everybody who goes there is like, it was a special experience to be able to do that. And right now, the school is going through the exact same thing we're going through collectively. I just was reading about it this morning, and I just made the connection this morning. So there's this pushback, even at that level, like in an academic setting, that's in honor of the soul, and they're in the process of pushing it back into the unconscious. And so, I mean, it's bizarre across the board, really, how much this is happening. So there's knowledge encoded in the symbolic content, which has value and is showing the way to embody it and transform our consciousness. So the way that we see this happening in the West is the way that we can see like that the feminine has been emerging is like, right, the yoga came to the West. All of this stuff has been happening. I think starting, I mean, there's probably stuff before this, like, you know, other bodies. It's not like it just started, but I think in our time, like things that we would relate to is like Freud published his interpretation to dreams in 1900. Jung really brought to the fore dreams, alchemy, story, the feminine, and a revision of Christianity, a new way of seeing Christianity. There was, you know, indigenous knowledge is really being valued more and more now, and the implications of that knowledge, like what is it that they believed and what they said, and do we need to incorporate that in our way of seeing? We've seen changes in Christianity with regard to Mary Magdalene and Jesus and the ideas around that, their relationship. The Nag Hammadi and Dead Sea Scrolls have come out in the I think the Nag Hammadi was the 50s. I don't know when the Dead Sea Scrolls was. When they found that was hidden. When it was being repressed, they took those documents and they hit scrolls and they hid them so that they couldn't be destroyed. The information that they believed had such value and came out right when we needed it. It's like the fairy tales I've talked about. They're in the culture and they're in our consciousness for as long as they're needed. When they're no longer needed, they go away. But here what you have is this information was preserved and came into consciousness at the time that we could pick it up and run with it again. And the Nag Hammadi in particular is the things that were excluded from the Bible, the stories that didn't make it in. And of course, they have a very different perspective on some of the stories are fascinating about women who are empowered and they rock. So I have some favorites in there. I highly recommend it. I think Marvin Mayer's the version I have, which I absolutely love and recommend. And what we also see during this time especially is this proliferation of the divine feminine in the goddesses. And of course that goes back to Gumbuddhas and other people who did work around the feminine. The fairy tales, as I've talked about before, they show the beginning, which is where the feminine is in the culture. They're saying what is the current status, and what we saw in the fairy tales over and over and over again was the feminine and how she was portrayed. The mother was shown as silent, she was hidden, she had died, she was consuming, she was powerless. She was not in alignment and healthy in terms of someone who was empowered and could impact what was happening. One of the few women that I can think of from these stories was the king's mother in The Handless Maiden. She was the one who kind of seemed to have some amount of consciousness and some amount of agency that we really did not see in those women that were in the stories. And then the good mother died, and so that means the mother collectively it has gone into the unconscious. And that's what the fairy tales and the stories are trying to get us to bring back, the alchemists and a lot of this alternative information. We see it in The Wizard of Oz, Beauty and the Beast, in Shalina. The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's an orphan, right? There's no mother. And there's in the Wasteland. Again, here we are with Excalibur, the King Arthur story. They're all talking about the current collective situation that we're in and how we're going to get out of this and what we need to do. So the feminine then, as I've talked before, morphed into the stepmother, the witch, these characters that became the ones who were going to challenge the feminine, the heroine in the story. Again, in a symbolic perspective, they challenged her to awaken, to come back into her power. So we're taking these fairy tales and these stories back now in order for us to awaken now, because now is the time for us to participate in the emergence of this consciousness, and to do it in a way where we're not regressing, where we're not getting this pushback, where it stays. And one of the things that came to me this morning is I think the advent of the internet has kind of been critical. I've really thought a lot about why has we gone so far. I mean, I hear about this from astrologers and all kinds of people saying, like, we were supposed to be out of this. Why a long time ago? Like, how come we haven't gone along even with the astrology of this? And the thing is that where we are now, I think it required us to go so far out of balance, because I think the internet needed to be online so this information could be so disseminated so far and wide as to not be able to be pushed back. Although there may be, in which we're seeing now, some evidence that there's this attempt to do so, I think ultimately it should fail because of the amount of information that's already out there and in the collective. You can't put the lid back on this. I think it's just too far gone. We'll have to watch it play out to see how it turns out. But so as I was saying, now rights are being challenged, women's bodily autonomy, the right to vote, the role in society, the value of the feminine, their life, their voice, and their work are all being questioned. And feminine is about equality. It's about connection, community, and inclusion. So these are the things that are all being pushed away. We're being pushed apart. We're being separated. There's like all these artificial divisions getting put into the way things are, into our perception of how things are, and othering people over and over again. So there's a desire to regress into a place where we have historically gone. So this is where we're breaking the pattern. Betty Kovacs talked about these 5 times that the Renaissance happened, and 4 times they went back into the unconscious. It was a pattern, this over and over again, this descent and come out, descend and come out, descend and come out. In order to not descend again, we have to come into a place where we understand that we are the change And we are the ones that have to break the patterns inside of ourselves. And that's specifically what I'm talking about today, like I said, on I think a deeper level. The masculine wants to retain power. The ego is resistant to change sometimes. And so the only way to transform that resistance is to keep working at it. And if we're at the front edge of this transformation, then sometimes it can feel a little bit challenging, because it can be this obviously this pattern has been entrenched for thousands of years. And the resistance is that they don't want equality, that's not what they don't want. Equality, they don't want inclusion, they don't want kumbaya, like all community, and we're all in this together, creating the world as a better place. So looking at the DNC from, again, a kind of a symbolic perspective, not from a political perspective, what we saw was that women were much more at the forefront. There were a lot of women's voices that were being heard. There was a lot of, I didn't watch it all, but I heard that there were a lot of stories about mothers, which is interesting, right? This kind of revaluing of the mother, which the fairy tales pointed out, like how that was a problem, how they were silent, how they were hidden, how they didn't have power, they didn't have value. So this is all like coming out now with where we are. And there's community connection, care for all was kind of the message. And what we also saw at the same time was a masculine that's valuing, like not a, but many men who were valuing the feminine, who were speaking up for the feminine, who were like showing emotion and showing love and showing care. And so I think that a lot of these things kind of suggest how interesting is this, that this is what's coming out on the other side of this attempt to retain power in the patriarchal kind of mindset. And on the other side, this is what we're seeing coming out again in the culture. So because we're collective, we have to change inside to change the outside. So we want to look specifically at our relationship to the feminine and all of these different aspects of it that I've been talking about, and look inside of ourselves to see how that is. How do we handle our emotions? How do we handle our intuition? Are we listening? Are we just slowing down and honoring ourselves, honoring these parts of ourselves? Are we spending time in the heart, spending time with the soul? Like, are we doing the things that actually make us feel nourished and make us feel healed and make us feel whole? Our lives reflect our relationship to the feminine. And again, that's what makes it healthier. It makes it feel better. So the fairy tales have been taking us through these so that we can embody them. So what we want to do is, I'm going to go a little bit over today, explore the implications of the embodiment of the feminine. And so it's an understanding that it's not just about knowing these things, but truly embracing them, and like coming to terms with emotions, allowing them to flow, allowing ourselves to feel them because it's healing, allowing ourselves to access the intuition and to listening to our voice, because that's going to guide us to a new place in our lives. Can get out of the habits and the ways that we are caught in the conditioned mind. So when we look at interconnection, for example, we look at what does it mean in terms of interconnection with how I'm relating to others, how I'm relating to people in my family, my neighbors, like, other people, like really looking at that. What does it mean if there's interconnection? Really understanding these things on a deeper level. What does it mean if we're inherently equal? And this idea of a democracy is based on that, which I find so fascinating, is that a lot of the things that this culture, our country was founded on, were ideals that actually are aligned with greater truth in a lot of ways. It may not have played out perfectly, but the idea, I believe, is that these were the seeds that were planted, and that as we evolve in consciousness, we will begin to embody these things. The more aligned we're going to be with those principles of one thing, in particular, something like equality. non-judgment. What does it mean if I'm not judging? If I'm not judging myself and I'm not judging anyone else at the same time? Like, it really, when you start to really look at this, you see how much and how subtle the judgments are. Like, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. Like, all of it is based in judgment. So, really, again, going into this and seeing how is this like a thing? Like, how am I living this? Am I really non judgmental of myself and others? And really questioning the situation, the things that we do judge, and seeing, like, is this something I really do need to continue to judge or not? We want to surrender, let go, and trust. That kind of thing, as you've heard me talk about with regard to the fairy tale, requires a level of safety and security and trust in what's unseen. And so from the patriarchal, materialistic standpoint, to actually value that makes no sense whatsoever. It seems absolutely like insanity to even consider doing that. And so it's not like basing it on some external deity somewhere off in another realm, but actually it's right here. It's trusting life, trusting all of these things. And like I said, if you're in judgment, if you're in a sense of us and them, or that there's an enemy, it's very hard to do this, to surrender and let go of control, if there's an idea that there's things that you need to be protected from and you need to defend yourself from. So we look at the primacy of the inner, that it comes first, and that the outer is based on what's happening within. So listening to dreams is another thing that, again, something the culture has told us doesn't have value. It does have value. And the more that you don't have to take my word for it, but if you aren't listening, is to just start, and you will find like how valuable and how much value there is in them. Slowing down, shifting emphasis out of the material, not so much focused on the material as focused on the immaterial and other things. Maybe not, that's not necessarily the best way to say it, is not putting it on one and on the other, but to actually say these things work together. It's not like, okay, now we just get rid of all of this and everything that's to do with the left brain, and now we're just going to completely go to the right brain. It's about learning how to work with these things. Both things have value. That equality is inside us as well as outside of us. So it's understanding the value of both of these things in us and learning how to bring them together. So answers, solutions, we're used to looking outside. Go to the internet, ask the AI, like we're looking at books, we're looking at teachers, we're looking at a lot of outer things, and it's like I do this in sessions a lot, is try to get people to go back on and find the answers in themselves, because that is where the empowerment lays, in understanding that we have answers. We're able to find the answers to things. And the empowerment, taking the power back from the external. All of these things, like in some ways, are interwoven and interconnected, like the idea of us and them. So that's changing that when you take your power back and you become empowered yourself again. And something like wholeness, like the implications of wholeness. What does this mean to be whole? And if I am whole, then what is ever lacking? If someone passes away, if someone dies, like how can, if I'm whole, then I can't lose anything. I didn't lose something. So again, it's like you contemplating this, like, how is this possible that this is true? So using these things that I've learned from the fairy tales about where we're going, what's emerging in consciousness, as we begin to like ponder them, question them, and contemplate them, we can begin to see how we can more honestly embody them. And embodying the divine, like most of us who are spiritual know this. It's like, I mean, even some in physics are coming to this, that we're all like this quantum soup of one thing, and that one thing is the divine. And so if that is the case, then are we living that? is that something we're actually living. And that means we have power, and we have all kinds of things available to us, that answers whatever. And we're not really accessing those things that we can access if we begin to do that. So these are the things that I think are important in terms of embodying the feminine consciousness, transforming our inner world, what we see, what we believe, what we know. And most of us have had lots of experiences that, and I think I mentioned this maybe last week, that we dismissed because they didn't fit into that original paradigm of conditioning. And so these things that are contrary, that don't fit, that like me having that vision that I just immediately dismissed, like, oh, that's just not real. And or you wake up from a dream, right? Oh, that's not real. And then something happens and you're like, oh, wait a minute. But does it change you? And do we allow these things to change us, these insights, these informations, these things that don't fit? And so it's really expanding our awareness to include those things and begin to really allow them to transform us and help us to embody this new consciousness. If you're still with me, thank you so much for listening. It was a little long today, but yeah, I think it's really important. So if you have any questions, you can always DM me or put them under the video. Most of you know that, and just do it when you have a question. But anyway, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Take care.